Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. I want to read a few verses from Genesis chapter 11 as we continue our series of signposts on the theme of living east of Eden. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Well, it seems that sin cannot be contained, and so within just within just a few chapters in the story of humans in Genesis, we learn that bloodshed and evil have spread everywhere. And so God's judgment fell on humanity in the form of a flood, which only Noah and his family survived. In Genesis 9, after the flood waters receded, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." The rest of chapters 9 and 10 are an account of them doing exactly that. In chapter 11, we come to a well-known story, the account of the confusing of language at the Tower of Babel. The story of the Tower of Babel is, if you like, the final nail in the coffin of the idea that humans can live in harmony and peace without God in the land east of Eden. It also helps us to understand why peace outside Eden will always be fragile and temporary, and why no stable human society, marriage or family is possible while human beings are alienated from the God who is one. It's often been pointed out that the story of the Tower of Babel doesn't appear to be presented in Genesis in a strict chronological way. If you go back to Genesis chapter 10, you notice that it already mentions a number of different people groups with different languages dispersed across the world. So why place the Tower of Babel story out of its chronological sequence? Well, it could simply be a more detailed explanation of the description of multiple languages in Genesis 10, but actually it's probably more likely because the Tower of Babel story acts as a kind of summary account of the human condition without God. As such, it provides a suitable point of division between Genesis 11 and 12, where the focus of the story of humans shifts from humanity in general to Abram and through his descendants to Israel as the people of God. Modern readers think of history as a very straight line, a sequence of chronological events. Time moves in one direction. But ancient writers were really not concerned about that. They weren't concerned about the when of an event as much as the why it happened. And so events were placed in order to tell the story in a particular way. The Bible is history certainly in a sense, not perhaps as we would understand history today. It's interpreted history, although to be fair, a lot of the history we get today is very much an interpreted version of events. And in fact, it's that idea of placing different facets of the story in a certain order rather than chronologically that explains why the sequence of some events in the Gospels varies from Gospel to Gospel. If the story of the Tower of Babel is a summing up of the human condition without God, it doesn't paint a very attractive picture. For it shows that life after God means broken communities and scattered people. It begins with one people who have one language and ends with a scattered people with many different languages. And with the division of languages and the resulting scattering of humans, the unity and harmony that humanity experienced in the garden are now truly and fully broken. If you're familiar with the Bible, you'll have noticed that there's a similarity between the Tower of Babel and another place name that features so prominently in the story of Israel, Babylon. The connection is not accidental. For in Genesis 11:2, we find a seemingly harmonious group of people moving out to the floodplain of Shinar in what would later be known as Babylonia. In fact, the whole story is told in such a way that it becomes a sharply ironic polemic against Babylonian life, politics, and religion. What happens here at Babel will haunt the collective consciousness of the people of Israel in future generations. The people on the plain agreed to make bricks and bake them thoroughly, and that makes sense because there was no stone to build with on the floodplain. Certainly not enough stone to build a city. Making bricks might seem innocent enough, but centuries later, the Jews exiled in Babylon, reading this story, knew that this was exactly the same method of construction used by Nebuchadnezzar's builders, only in that case, it was them who were doing the brick making as slaves. We know this because archaeologists have excavated some of Nebuchadnezzar's bricks, so the old story of what happened at Babel would resonate down through the ages for the people of Israel. There's an old saying that the devil makes work for idle hands. And so on the face of it, it might seem like a good thing that these people on the plains of Shinar are doing something constructive, no pun intended. But when we consider their motives, we see that there is really a dark side to this seemingly positive activity. Genesis 11:4 gives their motivation and identifies the heart of the problem, and also in some way explains God's response to it. Come, they say, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. When we examine that statement carefully, we begin to understand why God responds to it the way that he does. The statement has 4 specific elements. The aim to build a city. The aim to build a tower in that city that reaches to the heavens. The aim to make a name for themselves. The aim not to be scattered throughout the earth. Now, the first 2 elements correspond to the last 2. The way not to be scattered throughout the earth is to build a city. The way to make a name for yourself is to build a tower, a monument. The core problem in this story here lies not in their activity, but in the revealed motivation for the building program. The whole point of the tower is to link the city to the heavens and to allow the people of the city to rule the world like gods. It's not that they want to build a tower to the heavens so that they'll be close to God. This is not expressing a desire to return to the intimacy of the Garden of Eden as if they were building a tower so they could finally reach God. Rather, this is about people wanting to be in the place of the gods, the very sin they committed in the Garden of Eden. And so, as we will see, the most significant part of the statement is that they want to make a name for themselves. The desire not to be scattered across the whole earth is a direct challenge to God and to his commands. In Genesis 9:11, God told Noah and his sons to be fruitful, to increase in number, and to fill the earth. The very command that he gave to Adam and Eve in Genesis 1:28. Just as in the garden, once again, this is mankind saying, we will decide what is best for us. Rather than obey God's command, humans seek to defy it. As one First Testament scholar puts it, what we have here is an account in which all the God-given abilities of human beings are deliberately focused on creating a society where God is redundant. The inhabitants of this human city view the Creator as irrelevant. Babel, then, is a masterclass in the folly and pride of man. For God's will for human beings is not that we find our joy in being praised, but that we find our joy in knowing and praising him. His will is not that we find our security in cities, but in the God whom we gladly obey. We should also note that the tower hints at a form of religion. Throughout history, towers have been religious instruments of social control, such as the pyramid temples in South America or the Khmer temple complex at Angkor Wat. The goal of such towers was always to keep the people subservient under the unifying power of religion. Martin Luther understood the phrase reaching to the heavens to mean it would be a place of worship. And he has a point, for we should not forget that the Bible traces all false religions back to Babylon. And as has already been implied, Babel and Babylon are one and the same. And the meaning of the word Babylon is gate of God. If we fast forward to Revelation 17 and 5, we read that Babylon is described as the mystery, the mother of prostitutes, and the abomination of the earth. And throughout the Bible, prostitution and abomination are commonly used to refer to false religion. It's well known in the history of religions that the religious beliefs of ancient Egypt, Rome and Greece and India, among others, all trace their origins back to ancient Babylon. And furthermore, the words to reach don't really actually appear in the Hebrew text. They're there to aid translation into English. The Hebrew text can be read to mean that the tower was in, on, with, or by the heavens. It's likely that what is meant is that the top of the tower was dedicated to the heavens as a place of worship. In fact, some scholars think that it had the representation of the heavens in the form of a zodiac on the top, and that might be a real possibility since astrology, which focuses on the zodiac, originated in Babylon. We shouldn't be in any doubt whatsoever that astrology is firmly condemned in the Bible, and whenever it is denounced, it's always identified with demonism or Satanism in the sense that Satan and his hosts were actually being worshipped in the guise of the signs of the planets. With all that in mind, it's not unlikely that Satan was as much behind the building of the tower in Babel as he was in the eating of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. And two things in God's response suggest that the inhabitants of Babel are about to be put in their place. Firstly, God refers to them as children of men, or more literally, sons of Adam. Although they were want to take God's place and be autonomous, they're not gods. This is a reminder that they are only human. Secondly, in an act of holy scorn, God has to come down to see their city and the tower that was reaching to the heavens. Although they want to build a heavenly tower, it's actually so far from heaven that God has to come down just to be able to get a good look at it. And so we should take note that the emphasis in the text is very much that the problem is not so much the building of the tower itself, but rather the motivation that lies behind it. It's clear from the Bible text that at the very least, their motivation was to exalt themselves above God, or at worst, to worship Satan. And God responds to all of this by confusing their languages so that they can't communicate with one another, and they're forced to abandon their building project and end up scattered across the earth. The very thing they sought to avoid. When God says that nothing they plan to do will be impossible, it's not to be understood literally. He doesn't mean they'll become gods, rather that if he leaves the rebellion unchallenged, there will be no limit to the reach of their evil. So in an act of sovereign love, God frustrates their plans. In 11 verse 9, we are told that the place was named Babel because the Lord had confused their language. And the reason for the name may well be that the word Babel sounds like the Hebrew word for confused. Critics of the Bible suggest that this reaction implies that God was feeling threatened and insecure, and so he reacts defensively against them. But actually, if God is truly God, then he can't act in any way other than how he acts here. He is the God who is one, the creator of the world. God cannot allow his godness to be challenged without the integrity of the universe being broken. What for us would be insecurity and arrogance, for God is utterly necessary and appropriate. He simply must ensure that his divine rule is unchallenged. The universe would fall apart if he didn't. God cannot allow human beings to succeed at playing at God. The objective fact is that he is the only true God, the creator and sustainer of the universe. And so we get to a point where humans are now well and truly scattered across the earth and divided by language. But again, that's not the end of the story. Babel will be undone in the most spectacular way. If we fast forward again to Revelation, to the end of the story, we see that God's act of judgment at Babel, which resulted in this division of people by languages, will ultimately serve the glory of Christ. In Revelation 5, verses 9 and 10, we see people of every tribe and language, people and nation who have been ransomed by the blood of Christ. This diverse people scattered across the world, divided by culture and language and all kinds of things, will be made one again, one people in Christ. And then in Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 to 10, we read, "And I saw a vast crowd, too great to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing in front of the throne and before the Lamb. They were clothed in white robes and held palm branches in their hands. They were shouting with a great roar, 'Salvation comes from our God who sits on the throne and from the Lamb.'" And so all that happens at Babel will be spectacularly undone at the end of all things. And people from every tribe and nation and language and people group will join together as one in glorifying and praising God, the very thing that we were made for. Thanks for listening.